The first storm in 3 years hit Pine Ridge like a reckoning. Isabel Duarte pressed her palms against the kitchen window, watching lightning fracture the Nevada sky above the skeletal remains of the old bridge. For 47 months, she'd counted every cloudless dawn, every brittle sunset that painted the dried riverbed below in shades of abandonment. Tonight, the heavens had finally cracked open, and the sound of actual rain on her tin roof felt like hearing a dead language spoken aloud. Her border collie, Copper, whined at the door, ears pricked toward something beyond the storm's fury. Isabel had learned to trust that dog's instincts. They'd kept her sane through the worst of her grief. What she couldn't have predicted was that this night would drag her from the shadows of her self-imposed exile and thrust her into a crisis that would either destroy what remained of Pine Ridge or finally grant her the absolution she'd been seeking since the day her husband's body was pulled from the twisted wreckage of her bridge design. The rain drummed against Isabel's windows with an intensity that seemed almost personal, as if the sky held some grudge against her small cabin perched on Pine Ridge's eastern edge. She'd been living here for 4 years now, ever since the bridge collapse that killed 7 people, including Marcus, her husband of 12 years who'd been driving to the hardware store for screws to fix their back gate. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 15 years designing bridges, calculating load distributions and stress tolerances, only to watch her masterpiece, the Clearwater span, crumble like a house of cards on a Tuesday morning in March. If you're someone who believes in second chances, you might want to stay with this story. Sometimes the universe has a way of offering redemption in the most unexpected packages. Isabel pulled her wool cardigan tighter and moved away from the window. The cabin felt smaller tonight, compressed by the weight of the storm and memories that pressed against her chest like stones. She'd moved here to disappear, to let the desert swallow her whole, but even in isolation, the guilt followed. Every morning she woke to the sight of the empty riverbed where the Clearwater once flowed, now nothing but cracked earth and the concrete pylons of her failed design standing like grave markers. The cabin itself had become both sanctuary and prison. Marcus had helped her choose the location during their 3rd year of marriage, back when they dreamed of building a weekend retreat where they could escape the pressures of her demanding career. They'd spent weekends hiking these hills, mapping out where the vegetable garden would go, debating whether to install solar panels or connect to the main grid. Now those same rooms echoed with conversations that would never be finished, plans that had died with him in the twisted metal below her bridge. Copper's whining grew more insistent. The dog paced between Isabel and the front door, his black and white fur bristling with an energy she hadn't seen in months. At 10 years old, Copper was her only companion, the only living thing that didn't flinch when she mentioned her name in what remained of Pine Ridge's business district. The townspeople weren't cruel, not exactly, but their silence spoke volumes. She was the engineer who'd miscalculated, the woman whose bridge had become a tomb. "What is it, boy?" she murmured, scratching behind his ears. Thunder crashed overhead, close enough to rattle the windows, and Copper bolted for the door, scratching at the wood with his claws. Isabel hesitated. She'd made peace with being a hermit, venturing into town only for supplies, keeping her head down, speaking to no one unless absolutely necessary. The storm was perfect weather for staying inside, for brewing another pot of coffee and losing herself in the technical manuals she still read compulsively, searching for the error she'd somehow missed in her calculations 4 years ago. But Copper was nearly frantic now, his tail rigid, his eyes fixed on something beyond the door. In all their years together, he'd never been wrong about danger. During the 3 months after the collapse, when Isabel had barely eaten or slept, Copper had somehow known when she was considering whether life was worth continuing. He'd pressed his warm body against her legs and refused to leave her side until the darkness passed. She pulled on her rain jacket and boots, grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The wind hit her like a physical blow, driving rain horizontally across the porch. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since sunset, and she could taste the metallic tang of lightning in the air. Copper bounded into the storm without hesitation, glancing back only to ensure she was following. The dog led her down the gravel path that connected her cabin to the old mining road. Water rushed in torrents down the hillside, carving new channels in the earth and turning the desert into a temporary river system. Isabel's flashlight beam bounced wildly as she struggled to keep her footing on the slick rocks. She hadn't been this far from her cabin after dark in over a year. The transformation of the landscape was both terrifying and beautiful. Desert plants that had survived 3 years of drought were suddenly drinking deeply, their leaves glistening in her flashlight beam like jewels. Ancient arroyos that had been bone dry were now roaring with runoff. carrying the detritus of years, tumbleweeds, animal bones, fragments of civilization that the desert had slowly claimed. The air itself felt different, charged not just with electricity but with the primal energy of water returning to a place that had forgotten its taste. Half a mile down the road, Copper stopped abruptly, his hackles raised. Isabel's flashlight illuminated the twisted wreckage of what had once been a white pickup truck with corporate logos on the doors. The vehicle had rolled multiple times before coming to rest on its side against a boulder, its undercarriage exposed to the storm. Steam rose from the crumpled hood, mixing with the rain to create an otherworldly fog. "Hello?" Isabel called out, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Is anyone hurt?" A weak cry answered her, not words but the unmistakable sound of human pain. Isabel scrambled over the loose rocks, her boots sliding on the wet stone, until she could peer through the spider-webbed windshield. Inside, a young woman with dark hair was pressed against the driver's side door, her face contorted with agony. She couldn't have been more than 25, wearing the khaki uniform of Clearwater Lithium Corporation, the mining company that had been circling Pine Ridge like vultures for the past 2 years. "Hold on," Isabel shouted, searching for a way to access the cab. The passenger door was crumpled shut, but the rear window had shattered completely. She cleared away the glass with her jacket sleeve and squeezed through the opening. The woman's name tag read Sarah Chen, and her dark eyes were wide with terror. "Please," she gasped, "I think the baby's coming." Isabel's heart lurched. She'd delivered exactly one baby in her life, her nephew during a camping trip when his mother went into premature labor, but that had been 15 years ago, in a clean cabin with boiled water and proper lighting. This was chaos, a mangled truck, a raging storm, and a young woman whose water had clearly broken. "Okay," Isabel said, forcing her voice to remain calm. "Sarah, right? I'm Isabel. I'm going to help you." She positioned herself as best she could in the cramped space, using her flashlight to assess the situation. "How far along are you?" 38 weeks, Sarah panted. "The contractions started an hour ago, but they're getting closer. Oh God, this wasn't supposed to happen like this." Isabel looked around the cab and noticed a leather briefcase wedged under the dashboard, its contents spilled across the floorboards. Among the scattered papers, she glimpsed something that made her blood freeze. Architectural drawings stamped with the Clearwater Span project number. Her project number. "Sarah, what were you doing out here?" Isabel asked, trying to keep her voice neutral while she helped the young woman into a more comfortable position. "I was driving to Reno," Sarah said between contractions. "I found something at the office, something about the bridge that collapsed. I was scared to tell anyone at the company, so I was taking it to the FBI field office." Another contraction hit, and she gripped Isabel's arm with surprising strength. "The baby's coming now." Isabel's mind raced. For 4 years, she'd tortured herself with the belief that she'd somehow failed in her calculations, that her incompetence had killed 7 people. But now, amid the wreckage of a lithium company truck, the original blueprints of her bridge were scattered like accusations. She wanted to examine them immediately, to understand what Sarah had discovered, but the young woman's needs took precedence. "We need to get you out of this truck," Isabel said. "Can you move?" Together they managed to extract Sarah from the wreckage and get her to a relatively sheltered spot under a rock overhang about 50 feet away. Isabel used her rain jacket to create a makeshift windbreak and positioned her flashlight to provide the best possible visibility. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, the rain was falling harder now, turning the desert floor into a network of rushing streams. Sarah's contractions were coming every 2 minutes. Isabel had no medical supplies, no clean towels, nothing but her hands and her determination to see both mother and baby through this ordeal safely. She talked Sarah through each contraction, coaching her to breathe and push when the time came. In the brief moments between contractions, Isabel found herself studying Sarah's face in the flashlight's glow. There was something familiar about her features, something that nagged at Isabel's memory. Then it struck her. Sarah looked remarkably like Dr. Elena Chen, the material scientist who had consulted on the original bridge project. The resemblance was too strong to be coincidental. "Tell me about the papers," Isabel said during a brief lull, partly to distract Sarah and partly because she needed to know. "What did you find?" "The original engineering reports," Sarah gasped. "Someone altered the specifications after you submitted them, changed the concrete mixture ratios, reduced the rebar density in the support columns. Your design was perfect, but they cheapened the materials to save money." The words hit Isabel like another lightning strike. For 4 years, she'd carried the weight of 7 deaths, including her husband's. She'd retreated from the world because she believed her incompetence had caused the tragedy. But if Sarah was telling the truth, then the collapse wasn't her fault. It was deliberate sabotage, corporate cost-cutting that had turned her bridge into a death trap. Who?
Isabel asked, her voice barely audible above the storm. I don't know for sure, Sarah said, but I found handwritten notes in the margins. Instructions to the construction foreman, signed with initials, the same initials that are on all the Clearwater Lithium environmental impact reports. She paused as another contraction began to build. My Aunt Elena warned me about this company before she died. She said they cut corners on everything, that someone needed to watch them. Another contraction gripped Sarah, stronger than the others, and Isabel realized there was no more time for questions. The baby was coming whether they were ready or not. She positioned herself to catch the child, her hands shaking not just from the cold but from the magnitude of what she was about to do. The next few minutes passed in a blur of controlled urgency. Sarah's pain filled the space under the rock overhang, mixing with the sound of rain and thunder to create a symphony of birth and storm. Isabel found herself drawing on instincts she didn't know she possessed, her hands moving with surprising confidence as she guided new life into the world. I can see the head, Isabel called out over the wind. One more push, Sarah. At 11:47 p.m., in the middle of a Nevada thunderstorm, under a rocky ledge that provided barely enough shelter to keep them from drowning, Sarah Chen's daughter entered the world. The baby's first cry was strong and healthy, a sound that somehow rose above the storm's fury and reached Isabel's heart like a hymn. Isabel wrapped the newborn in her dry sweater, clearing the tiny airways and making sure everything was functioning as it should. The baby was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and a pair of lungs that worked magnificently. She placed the child in Sarah's arms and watched the young mother's face transform with wonder and exhaustion. She's beautiful, Isabel whispered, and meant it. There was something profound about witnessing birth during a storm, about seeing new life emerge from chaos and darkness. It felt symbolic, though she couldn't quite name what it symbolized yet. As Sarah cradled her newborn daughter, Isabel couldn't help but think about the timing of this night. For 3 years the desert had been barren, lifeless, waiting. Now, in the span of a few hours, water had returned to the land, and a new life had been born. The synchronicity was almost overwhelming, as if the universe was trying to tell her something she'd been too grief-stricken to hear. While Sarah bonded with her daughter, Isabel retrieved the scattered papers from the truck. By flashlight, she studied her own blueprints, the ones she'd submitted 4 years ago, and compared them to the annotated versions Sarah had discovered. The differences were subtle, but damning. Concrete mixture ratios changed from her specified high-strength formula to a cheaper alternative. Rebar spacing increased from 6 inches to 10 inches in critical support areas. Foundation depth reduced from 40 feet to 30 feet. Each alteration, individually, might have been survivable. Together, they had created a structural weakness that made the bridge's failure inevitable. The worst part was the methodical nature of the changes. This wasn't random cost-cutting, but calculated sabotage designed to save money while maintaining plausible deniability. Isabel found the smoking gun buried in the middle of the stack, a memo from Clearwater Lithium's project manager to the construction foreman. Implement cost reductions per attached specifications. Bridge functionality not critical to long-term mining operations. Prioritize savings over longevity. The memo was dated 6 months before the bridge's completion, and 3 months before Clearwater Lithium had announced their intention to divert the Clearwater River to fill their evaporation ponds. They had planned from the beginning to eliminate the river that flowed under the bridge. In their minds, the bridge didn't need to last because it wouldn't matter once the water was gone, but they hadn't counted on people still needing to cross the empty riverbed. They hadn't considered that families would still use the bridge daily, that Marcus would drive across it on his way to buy screws for their back gate. Isabel's hands shook as she held the papers, rain running down her face like tears. 4 years of self-imposed exile, 4 years of believing she was a killer, and all of it based on a lie. She felt something crack open inside her chest, not breaking, but opening like a door that had been locked for too long. The revelation was both liberating and terrifying. If she wasn't responsible for the collapse, then the guilt that had driven her into isolation was based on a falsehood. But that also meant she'd wasted 4 years of her life hiding from a truth that wasn't true, mourning not just her husband but also her professional identity, her sense of purpose, her belief in her own competence. Isabel, Sarah called out weakly, I need to tell you something else, about the river. Isabel looked up from the papers. Sarah was pale, clearly exhausted from the birth, but her eyes were alert and urgent. There's a plan to open the diversion channels tomorrow morning, Sarah continued. Once the company trucks can get through after the storm, they're going to redirect the entire river flow to the mining operation. But that's not the worst part. She pointed to one of the papers Isabel hadn't examined yet, a hydrological survey with handwritten notes in the margins. If they divert the river while it's in flood stage, the backup will overwhelm the temporary dams they built upstream. The whole valley will flood, including the town. They know this, but they're doing it anyway. They want to force everyone out so they can expand the mining operation. Isabel studied the survey, her engineering mind automatically calculating flow rates and volume displacement. Sarah was right. The flooding would be catastrophic. Pine Ridge, what was left of it, would be underwater within hours of the diversion, but buried in the technical specifications, Isabel spotted something the Clearwater Lithium engineers had missed, a natural relief channel that had been carved by ancient floods, now hidden under decades of sediment buildup. If she could clear the blockage, the excess water would flow harmlessly around the town and into the desert basin beyond. The problem was access. The relief channel was on the other side of the riverbed, and the only way to reach it was across the space where her bridge used to stand. She'd need to build some kind of temporary crossing, and she'd need to do it before the company's security teams arrived in the morning. "Sarah," she said, "I need to get you and the baby somewhere safe, and then I need to get to that channel. There's a rescue shelter at the old mining camp," Sarah said, "about 2 miles north of here. But Isabel, the company has armed security. If they catch you interfering with their operation, then I guess I'll have to not get caught." Isabel helped Sarah and her newborn daughter to the abandoned mining camp, a collection of weather-beaten buildings that had housed copper miners in the 1940s. The main office had a working generator, and basic medical supplies left over from when the site had served as a way station for hikers. She got Sarah settled with warm blankets and clean water, and made sure both mother and baby were stable. The mining camp held its own ghosts, its own stories of boom and bust, of men who'd come to extract wealth from the desert, and left behind only empty buildings and contaminated soil. But tonight, it served as sanctuary for new life, a place where hope could take its first tentative breath, while the storm raged outside.
"What you're doing is insane," Sarah said, as Isabel prepared to leave. "You should call the FBI, let them handle it. By the time the FBI responds, it'll be too late," Isabel replied. "Besides, this is my fault. I designed a bridge that was sabotaged, and I spent 4 years hiding while people suffered for it. I won't hide anymore." She kissed the baby's forehead gently, marveling again at the miracle of new life emerging from such chaos. "What are you going to name her?" "Hope," Sarah said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope." Isabel left them with most of her supplies and headed back toward the riverbed. The storm was reaching its peak intensity, with lightning strikes so frequent they turned night into a strobing approximation of day. The Clearwater River, dry for 3 years, was now a raging torrent 40 feet wide and growing by the hour. She made her way to the twisted remains of her bridge, trying not to look at the memorial plaque someone had mounted on the eastern pylon. 7 names were etched in bronze, including Marcus Duarte, beloved husband and friend. For 4 years, she'd avoided this spot like a wound that wouldn't heal. Now she stood in the rain, studying the structural remains with professional eyes instead of grieving ones. The pylons were still sound. Her foundation work had been solid, even after the corporate sabotage. With the right materials and enough time, she could rig a temporary span that would support her weight long enough to reach the relief channel. Isabel spent the next 3 hours scavenging materials from the mining camp and her own property. Steel cables from an old drilling rig, wooden planks from a collapsed maintenance shed, rope and pulleys from her late husband's workshop. She worked by flashlight and lightning, her hands numb with cold, but her mind sharp with purpose for the first time in years. Marcus had been meticulous about maintaining his tools, and even 4 years after his death, everything was exactly where he'd left it. She found herself talking to him as she worked, explaining what she was doing, asking for his help in ways she hadn't since the day he died. "I need your strongest rope," she murmured to the darkness. "I need to build something that will hold just long enough to matter." The temporary bridge was ugly, a barely functional collection of cables and planks that swayed ominously in the wind. But her calculations were sound, and she'd built in multiple redundancies to account for the storm conditions. It would hold long enough. As dawn approached, the rain began to ease slightly, though the river continued to rise. Isabel could see headlights in the distance, the Clearwater Lithium convoy right on schedule. She estimated she had maybe 30 minutes before they reached the diversion point. She started across her improvised bridge, trying not to think about the irony of crossing another one of her designs above the ruins of the first. The cables held, the planks supported her weight, and she reached the far side just as the sun broke through the storm clouds. The relief channel was exactly where the geological survey had indicated, clogged with 40 years of accumulated debris and sediment. Isabel had brought a folding shovel and a small explosive charge she'd found in the mining camp, old dynamite, probably left over from the copper mining days, but still potent enough for her needs. She worked frantically to clear the channel mouth, using the shovel to remove rocks and debris, while keeping one eye on the approaching headlights. The explosive would clear the major blockage, but she needed to position it precisely to avoid collapsing the entire channel. As she worked, Isabel felt a strange sense of completion settling over her. This was what she was meant to do, not hide in guilt and shame, but solve problems, build solutions, use her skills to protect people. The relief channel wasn't just about saving Pine Ridge from flooding, it was about reclaiming her identity as an engineer, as someone who made things work. Voices echoed across the riverbed, company security, shouting orders and coordinating their approach. Isabel had maybe 5 minutes left. She placed the dynamite charge at the base of the largest debris dam, lit the fuse with her waterproof matches, and ran for cover behind a boulder outcropping. The explosion was smaller than she'd hoped, but sufficient to break up the blockage. Water immediately began flowing through the relief channel, carrying away debris and carving the channel deeper with each passing minute. "Hey, stop right there." Isabel turned to see 3 men in Clearwater Lithium uniforms approaching her position, their weapons drawn but not yet aimed. She recognized the lead man from newspaper photos, James Crawford, the company's head of security, and the same person whose initials were on the sabotage memos. "Duarte," Crawford called out, his voice carrying across the water, "you need to step away from that channel immediately, so you can flood the town." Isabel called back, "I don't think so. You're interfering with a legal mining operation. This is federal land and you're trespassing." Isabel almost laughed. After 4 years of being treated like a pariah, after carrying guilt that wasn't even hers to carry, she was supposed to be intimidated by a corporate thug who'd killed her husband for the sake of a profit margin. "James Crawford," she shouted, pulling the sabotage memos from her jacket. "These are your initials, aren't they? Your handwriting on the orders to weaken my bridge." She saw Crawford's expression change, even from a distance. Guilt and calculation warred across his features as he realized what she was holding. "You killed 7 people to save money on a bridge you planned to make irrelevant anyway," Isabel continued, "including my husband. So forgive me if I'm not particularly concerned about your legal mining operation." The relief channel was working perfectly now, carrying away the excess floodwater that would have inundated Pine Ridge. Isabel could see the water level in the main river beginning to drop as the pressure was relieved. The town was safe. Crawford raised his weapon, and Isabel realized she might not survive to see the results of her work. But then Copper appeared, barking furiously as he charged across her improvised bridge with 3 other dogs in tow. Apparently her collie had recruited reinforcements from the town's remaining residents. Behind the dogs came people: Sarah Chen, carrying baby Hope in a makeshift sling, Tom Martinez from the hardware store, Anna Kowalski from the diner, a dozen others who'd somehow learned what was happening. The sight of the townspeople crossing her makeshift bridge filled Isabel with a profound sense of vindication. For 4 years she'd believed these people blamed her for the tragedy that had befallen their community. Now they were literally crossing a bridge she'd built to stand with her against the real villains. "Put the gun down, Crawford," Tom called out, his own rifle visible across his arm. "This is our town, our water, and our choice." Crawford looked around at the growing crowd, then at the memos in Isabel's hands, then at the relief channel that was doing exactly what she'd designed it to do. His corporate security team suddenly seemed very small and very outnumbered. "This isn't over," he said, lowering his weapon. "Yes," Isabel replied, "it is. The Clearwater Lithium Corporation abandoned their Pine Ridge operations within a month. The FBI investigation that Sarah's evidence triggered revealed a pattern of environmental crimes and corporate malfeasance that extended far beyond one sabotaged bridge. The company's assets were seized, its executives indicted, and its Nevada mining permits revoked. Isabel Duarte was exonerated completely. The Engineering Review Board reinstated her license with a formal apology, and she received compensation for the 4 years of lost income and reputation damage. More importantly, the 7 families affected by the bridge collapse finally learned the truth about how their loved ones had died. But the real transformation happened on a smaller scale, in the quiet spaces between official vindication and public redemption. Isabel moved back to town, opened a small engineering consulting practice, and began designing not bridges but water management systems for the desert communities that were learning to thrive without corporate interference. She never remarried, but she was no longer alone. Sarah Chen and baby Hope, now a toddler who called Isabel Auntie, lived in the converted apartment above her office. The 3 of them formed an unconventional family, bound by the storm that had brought them together. Isabel's consulting practice grew slowly but steadily. Word spread through the desert communities about the engineer who had saved Pine Ridge, and soon she was designing innovative water reclamation systems for small towns throughout Nevada. Her specialty became sustainable infrastructure that worked with the desert environment rather than against it. She developed a reputation for solutions that were both elegant and durable, built to last generations rather than quarters. The work was different from her previous career designing major municipal projects. These were smaller communities with limited budgets but unlimited determination to survive and thrive in harsh conditions. Isabel found that she preferred this scale of engineering projects, where she could know the people who would use her designs, where the impact of her work was immediately visible and personally meaningful.
beautiful. On rainy nights, which came more frequently now that the river flowed freely again, Isabel would sit on her porch and listen to the water rushing under the new bridge, an elegant span she'd designed as a memorial to the 7 people who died, built to standards that would outlast any corporate sabotage. The memorial bridge had become her masterpiece, a structure that embodied everything she'd learned about both engineering and humanity. It was overbuilt by conventional standards, designed to withstand floods that might come once in 1,000 years, constructed with materials that would still be sound when Hope's great-grandchildren were old. But it was also beautiful, its lines flowing like water itself, its supports rising from the riverbed like natural stone formations. Copper, now 12 and showing his age, would curl up beside her chair, his grey muzzle resting on her knee. Sometimes Sarah would join them with Hope, and they'd watch the lightning illuminate the restored river while the little girl slept peacefully in her mother's arms. These were the moments when Isabel understood that redemption wasn't a destination but a process, not a single act of heroism but a daily choice to build rather than hide, to trust rather than withdraw, to believe that even the most broken things could be made whole again. 5 years had passed since that September storm, and Pine Ridge had blossomed into something none of its residents could have imagined. The relief channel Isabel had carved had become the centerpiece of a natural park, where families came to picnic beside the flowing water, and children played in pools that had once been barren rock. The old mining camp had been transformed into an environmental education center, where Sarah now worked as the head researcher, studying sustainable water management in arid climates. Hope was learning to swim in the very waters her birth had helped save. At 5 years old, she was fearless in the water, diving and splashing with the confidence of someone who had never known scarcity. Isabel often watched from the bank, marveling at how this child born in a storm, delivered by inexperienced hands, had become the bright center around which their small community revolved. The new bridge stood testament to Isabel's renewed faith in her craft. Built with materials that would last centuries, designed to withstand floods far greater than anything the desert had seen, it connected not just 2 sides of a river, but 2 versions of herself, the woman who had hidden in shame and the one who had learned to build in love. The town's transformation extended beyond infrastructure. With the mining company gone and the water flowing freely, Pine Ridge had attracted new residents, artists, writers, environmental researchers and others, seeking a place where community mattered more than profit. The population had tripled, but it maintained the close-knit feel of a place where everyone knew everyone else's story. Isabel had found herself becoming something of an elder stateswoman, despite being only in her mid-40s. Younger engineers sought her out for advice, drawn by stories of her dramatic vindication and her innovative approaches to desert engineering. She mentored them carefully, sharing not just technical knowledge, but the hard-won wisdom about the responsibility that came with their profession. "We don't just build structures," she would tell them, "we build trust. Every calculation, every specification, every decision we make affects real people living real lives. Don't let anyone pressure you into compromising that responsibility, not for money, not for convenience, not for any reason." On quiet evenings, when the sunset painted the water gold and the desert air carried the scent of sage and possibility, Isabel would walk across that bridge and remember the night when everything changed. She would think of Marcus, whose death had finally found meaning in the lives that were saved. She would think of the 7 names on the memorial plaque and how their story had become part of a larger narrative about justice and redemption. But mostly, she would think about the moment when Hope had taken her first breath in the middle of that storm, and how sometimes the most beautiful things are born in the darkest hours. The rain had washed away more than just 4 years of drought. It had washed away the version of herself that believed she was beyond saving. Now, as she stood on her bridge watching the Clearwater River flow toward tomorrow, Isabel Duarte finally understood that home was not a place you find, but a place you build, one careful calculation at a time. The desert had taught her that water, when it finally comes, doesn't just fill the empty spaces. It carves new channels, creates new possibilities, transforms the landscape into something it was never meant to be but somehow always could have been. If you're facing your own bridge collapse, your own season of drought and self-imposed exile, remember that storms don't last forever, but the changes they bring can be the beginning of something beautiful. Sometimes the very thing that seems like the end is actually just the start of a better story. What bridges in your own life might need rebuilding? What relief channels might you need to clear? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding hope in unexpected places.